I'm Derek Eyring. I've been in the real estate business for over 3 decades. I'm an entrepreneur at heart, and I'm always paying attention to real estate trends, industry innovators, and business influencers.
I'm Alan Smith. For over 25 years, I've helped buyers and sellers with their real estate needs. Join us on this podcast. Let's talk about strategies to help you play this real estate game to win.
Join us as we search out the latest trends, hot topics, red flags, and deal breakers in every episode of Market Movers. Hey, Al.
It's another month.
You're looking very fall-like today.
Thank you. I'm feeling fall-like. I feel like I could go out and cut down trees.
That's kind of what I'm thinking you should, it looks like that's what you're ready for.
I'm ready. I am ready.
Are you ready for some real estate information today?
Yeah. There's actually some interesting things that have been popping up here that we probably could discuss. I think people would get a kick out of. So.
One of them, the first one I'm thinking of is the Zillow list for things that buyers, what was the title of that?
So they just came out with an article entitled "The 22 Mistakes Buyers Make and how they can avoid them." And give or take, whether you like Zillow or don't like Zillow, that's really beside the point. Most consumers view Zillow as a trusted source of real estate information.
For sure.
And so it's helpful if we know what they're communicating to, in this case, buyers, and especially first-time buyers, and what they're telling the buyers they should be doing to navigate, traps.
Yeah.
So of the 22 things on the list, 12 of them can be summed up in one simple statement, which is talking about the importance of them working with a lender to start with.
Yeah.
Getting in front of a lender, getting pre-approved, knowing exactly what their financial picture looks like, what their monthly mortgage payment's going to be, those types of things. We know day in and day out how important it is, but really 10 of those always circled back to using a good lender and trusting in the process and getting them as a trusted partner in the transaction.
Yeah, the lending side, I think people take for granted sometimes. On both sides of a real estate transaction, a good local, preferably lender, is key. They know the local market, they know the programs. If I'm a listing broker and somebody brings an offer and it's from XYZ lender from out of state, my red flag goes up. I advise my clients. And if there's another offer right behind it with a local lender that we can reach out to easily, then that's who we're going to probably advise our clients to pick. And we do, have conversations with those lenders before we advise our clients about anything.
Yeah, one of the challenges in using an out-of-area lender that you've never met before is even if they're a great lender, and there are obviously good online lenders out there, but the communication that needs to take place between the brokers, their clients, and the lender is so pivotal to the success of the transaction. That communication string is not going to exist like it does with a local lender. You may even have the file handed off 2 or 3 different times to different people during the life of the transaction. And so I always tell clients, even if you're approved and you feel good about, as Houdini's House of Home Loans, now you see us, now you don't, even if you're approved through that resource, it doesn't hurt to get a second opinion from somebody that's local, that knows the market, that knows maybe what some other programs are available in that particular market might be too. So,
we go out of our way to make sure that we at least have that conversation with our clients. And you might have a preference if you're a buyer that you had a good experience with a lender, and if they're not local, we still will ask you to at least give somebody else a shot at take a look at it that is local, that really knows the area and the programs and the markets.
Yeah. So to sum that part of it up, the partnership you have with a good lender is pivotal to the success of your transaction.
Absolutely.
Really is important. So if you step aside from the lender connection issues that they brought up, one of the first things they also brought up was a big mistake for buyers is hesitating to ask for information or clarity in the transaction. There's a lot of times as real estate brokers, we take for granted that what we're telling somebody or what we're discussing, they understand 100%. And especially if they're a first-time home buyer, they may not understand what earnest money means. They may not understand what the closing process looks like. And do you sign before you get your keys? There's all these things that they don't even know are questions because they've never thought of these things before. And we just assume they know them. So I'd like to remind people, it's not the buyer's job to understand the process. That's what we're for. It's our job to communicate the process effectively so that we can keep them in the loop on what's going on.
Yeah, that's kind of a good note for buyers and agents to spend a little time up front, sit down with each other and talk about the whole process. Agents try to avoid using proprietary kind of form language like Form 17 and all that kind of stuff. Talk in simple terms that people that aren't in the business every day talking about it will understand. And get to know each other, because that's where the hesitancy is, right? Yep. I don't want to bug John because, I don't want to come off sounding like I don't know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. And there are a lot of people, you can tell that their eyes will start glazing over and you realize, okay, I just lost the audience.
Right.
And so using a lot of industry lingo or slang or whatever doesn't really communicate the message. And there's also something to be said for if you're a buyer, don't hesitate to ask questions, because
that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, your broker may not understand that they just glossed over something that's confusing.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we all want everybody to be in the loop and feel comfortable about what the next steps are in the process.
Right. So that first sit down if you're a buyer with your agent with your buyer is really crucial. I think spend a good half hour. You're about to test the waters in what might be the largest financial transaction of your life. Spend a half an hour talking about it before you actually jump out there.
Yeah, so many people that say, okay, I'll meet you at the little yellow house down the street. The first meeting, ideally, let's meet in a coffee shop. Let's sit down. Let's have a cup of coffee. Let's talk about the market. Let's talk about what's going on in this area that you want to live in. Here's what some recent transactions have kind of looked like. Here's what percentage of list price sellers are getting. Here's how much time these houses are spending on the market. Educating the buyer is so important because it helps them craft their offer, and maybe they realize, okay, I thought maybe these sellers were getting nervous because they've been on the market 2 weeks, when in reality, market time in this area at this price point is 58 days. So maybe they're not quite so nervous like I thought they might be. Yeah. Buyers need to know that information. And so much of it when we're walking around a house is so easily forgotten because we're distracted by the kitchen and things like that. I've always find sitting down, having a cup of coffee, and just talking about what the market is doing, what they ideally would like to accomplish, is the perfect way to go.
Absolutely. The next one is kind of key as well. And let me tell you a little story behind this. It's not being aware of closing costs. When the market was really hot, I had some folks, and the interest rates were starting to change and going north, right? So I had some folks that were qualified previously at a lower rate, got back into the market a couple months later as the rates were going up. They found their house, and what happened after was a little bit unfortunate. They got into contract, they got with their lender with the new rate, and they discovered that they couldn't stomach. It was indigestible to them, the payment. So that's a tough way to find out. You're in contract, you have earnest money on the line, you've maybe even paid for your inspection, and then you circle back with your lender to discover that, the rates have changed, and that's a lot more payment than I thought.
Right. Yeah. Well, that happens frequently, especially right now. Rates are pretty volatile. They're up, they're down, they're up, they're down, just like the stock market every single day, several times during the day for a fact. So, having that communication with that lender, are they locked in? Are they not? Why are we not locked? Where are we at in the transaction? Nobody wants surprises like that, for sure.
Yeah, it's not good for either party. Imagine how the seller feels when you have to call them and say, I know we're kind of halfway to closing, but my buyer can't afford to purchase this house now.
Yeah, long after they forget what they paid for the house, they're still living in the payment.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people will be more sensitive to payments than others, but you need to know that. And kind of to piggyback on that too is the idea that some closing costs might be able to be negotiated with the seller.
Very
So
good point.
you
Really
have,
good point.
You have the ability to go in and negotiate some of these things that can help relieve some of that burden on the buyer they may not even know about.
And that's why you have that first sit down meeting that we were talking about, to talk about those things. Like, how much cash do you have to put down? And do you know about closing costs?
Right.
A lot of people aren't aware. They think, well, I have title and escrow?
So that's in addition to my down payment?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right? And then we all forget about things like prepaids that the lender requires for insurance and that sort of thing. That all adds up.
Right.
So very important that we have those conversations, that we know how much you need to put down and we know how much closing costs you need. And does that fit into your picture? Do you need us to negotiate that for you? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and knowing what your monthly payment is likely going to look like, because otherwise we'll walk into the perfect house of your dreams, and there it is. And now all of a sudden you start double clutching because now you're worried about finances. And instead of trying to figure out whether the house is going to work for you and, is the backyard how you want it and the kitchen and all these things, now you're worried about finances. If you get the financial stuff out of the way first with a good lender, now you can go shopping for a house. And as long as we stay in this range, we can handle this monthly payment. No problem. Let's go find the house we want to live in. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then you're along in this process and you're looking at houses. And sometimes, we've all had this happen. Our buyers make an offer, they make a great offer, and they get beat out.
Yeah. So it's important, I think, to remind folks that, not every offer is successful. You really don't have any control over what the competition is doing out there. If there's multiple buyers vying for the same property, you may lose out on a house or two. And the longer you've been in this business as a real estate broker, you can sure share stories of multiple buyers and there are multiple offers that they lose out on. It's important to, I think, walk them back off the edge a little bit, and just, I always like to tell people that, fate's a funny thing, especially in real estate. Sometimes things are meant to be. Now, we don't know that there's something better around the corner until we see it. And right now we haven't gotten to the corner yet. So we didn't get this one. Let's regroup. Let's just keep looking. Something's bound to turn up. It might even be the house that's not even on the market yet.
Yeah, I can't think of a single time where I've worked with a buyer and say they've kind of missed out on a couple of things, where the final house that they ended up with, they didn't say it was meant to be. I'm really glad we didn't end up with those other houses.
You almost always say, I'm sure glad we didn't get that little blue house because, this one is so much better. So, so that was one of the other takeaways, is just don't take that rejection personally.
Absolutely. All right, the next one.
The other one was buying more house than you can afford. And I guess it goes back to the lender
It
again.
sure does.
If you've talked to a good lender, you know how much house you can afford, and know that a lot of things like the price and the closing costs are part of the negotiation and the give and take of any real estate transaction. But ultimately, here's why this is important for a broker. If you go out and show a bunch of properties to people and they're not really approved yet and they don't have their finances all knuckled down, well, you went out and you showed them a bunch of houses in a certain price range, and then they found out that they qualify and they're comfortable with the prices maybe $100,000 more. Well, okay, guess what? You just wasted all your time showing them these other houses, because now they want to go see the houses with the 3-car garages and maybe waterfront and, whatever this happens to be, right?
Right.
So that's not a good use of your time. On the flip side,
I was just going to go there.
yeah, so the flip side is you showed them too expensive. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden they find out, well, we're really only qualified for this, 100,000 less. Now they just lost the granite countertops. They lost the 3rd garage bay. They lost the...
That's even worse.
Yeah, the self-activated doggy door. They've lost all these things. And now everything you show them, they're not going to like.
Yeah.
Because they just saw these great properties and now they're looking at 100,000 less. So overbuying a house or looking at houses that you can't afford is really, really a bad situation for both the broker and the clients from a time constraint.
Yeah, and on the broker side, we always want to be accommodating. When we first meet folks, we want to get them out right away if that's what they want to do. And we have a little adage that everyone gets one free ride on the merry-go-round.
Right.
Right, and that means that, of course, we want to take you to the house you want to see, but then let's talk. Let's get into that buyer meeting that we were just talking about.
Right.
Let's really get this sorted out, so we're not just, ready, fire, aim, right?
Yeah, and I think it's become easier a little bit now because of the buyer representation agreements
Yeah.
that we're automatically engaging in right out of the gate. Now it's much easier to start talking about other types of paperwork that maybe they need to do. But it's just important to have those conversations for sure.
Yeah, I really look at the buyer agreements as an opportunity to have these conversations in more depth.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings to mind one of the other mistakes the Zillow article mentioned was buyers not researching agents.
Yeah, I mean, that's big.
Think about how you met your last real estate agent. Did you meet them at an open house? Did you meet them randomly in the line at the coffee shop? Are they a relative or a friend? How did you meet this person? There's a lot to be said for picking somebody that knows that market and it has experience in that market. And I don't want to suggest that a newer agent isn't the right person to go
No,
with.
that's not what we're saying at
A
all.
lot of times they're the better
It might
choice.
be the better choice.
I know a lot of grizzled old veterans that have been part-time for 27 years in their mind.
Yeah.
And they don't know the new forms and they don't know even how to open a key box with their cell phone. So that's not what we're talking about. But do they know the market? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like they're being honest with you? Are you working together to help get you in the house you want to live in? That's a great way for buyers, I think, to look at that relationship. And if you want to hop around and pick agent after agent after agent based on convenience, that ultimately doesn't lead to success. It's best to pick somebody that you can trust and just work with them and value what they're telling you and bringing to the table. As long as you're open and honest with them, they can give you the feedback you need. It's probably a much smoother transaction. Transactions are always roller coaster rides, but at the end of the day, you want it to be a fun ride, not a terrifying ride.
Let's touch a little bit on your convenience part. So, it's pretty common if people find their agents online, they'll start calling and because they want to see a particular property. And that's great. That's one way to do it, right? But the big thing is when you meet your potential broker, do you engage well with them? Or is it somebody that you'd want to represent you? You got to really kind of think in that way about them.
Right.
Not that they just were there to open the door, but is this somebody that I really feel like would be a good representation of me?
Yes.
That's the important part because they're going to be talking to other brokers. They're going to be pitching your purchase and sale, hopefully, and you want to make sure that they come off well.
Yeah. How well does the agent that you're working with get along with other agents?
That's important.
That's pretty important.
And the only way to really gauge that if you don't know is to see how well you get along with them, right?
That's usually the best indicator right off the bat.
If they hit you with a bunch of stuff that you're like, who is this person?
Right.
And maybe you ought to move on to somebody. Just because they open the door doesn't mean you're stuck with them.
Right. So bottom line is if they have local experience, that's always a good starting point. If your broker says to you, where's Tacoma? Then it might not be the best way to start.
If that's where you're looking.
Yeah, if that's where you're looking. Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. The next one was considering only turnkey homes. And, when you're out, especially first-time home buyers, there's sort of been a trend in the last 10, 15 years that even a first-time home might have upgrades like granite countertops and sort of remodeled and kind of in great condition. That wasn't always the case. We've touched on this before.
Right.
Back in the day, you just expected your first house was going to be a little bit of a fixer-upper, right? And so, you have to consider everything, right? Can I do a little bit of work to this house and build some equity? Right. Do I really need to have all these bells and whistles for another $50,000?
Exactly.
When I can live without it and do it over time.
Yeah, and part of that is, buyers oftentimes, especially first-time home buyers, they kind of know the circumstances they grew up in, which a lot of times was their parents' fourth or fifth or sixth house. Yeah. They don't know what mom and dad started out with on house number one, right?
They
the one on
know.
right behind the train tracks that had an outhouse. Yeah. They don't know about that house.
Right.
So having the ability to be realistic, you can, if you're willing to put some sweat equity into these houses, that's where a lot of times you can get more affordable housing,
Yeah.
and maybe have a more comfortable mortgage payment each month, so you're not living on top ramen for the next 5 years.
Exactly. Now it has to be financeable, and that's why you need a broker to
Yes.
kind of guide you through and say, okay, yeah, this one, this particular house, here's what they're looking for as far as safety features or things that the appraiser is looking for, so it's financeable. So that's why you hire a broker. Hey, don't even bother offering on this house because it's never going to get approved for a loan.
Right,
So
right.
you gotta keep that in mind as
Yeah,
well.
sometimes we have to put on our Columbo hat and do some questioning just to figure out, is this doable?
Yeah,
Right?
So that's important. Next one, writing off homes that have lingered on the market.
So there's an interesting phenomenon going on right now for people that remember the COVID years. We'd see something that had been on the market for 3 days, and we would say, "Oh my gosh, the sellers must be getting panicked. They haven't sold their house yet, right?"
Right.
Well, so if you have that mindset and you go into a normal market where things just take a while, right? They may be looking at a house and saying, "Gosh, this house has been on the market for 24 days. They must be getting nervous."
Right.
Well, it kind of goes back to what we talked about originally. If you're fortunate enough to work with an agent that's shown you, well, gosh, in this area, in this price range, the average market time is 58 days. So maybe they're not so nervous. And we talked about that at the beginning of this podcast. But that's critical to understand whether or not the seller might be getting nervous and maybe willing to accept something else. There's a couple other things that take place too. The longer the house sits on the market, the more the seller's perfect price tends to change.
Exactly.
At a certain point, when we put the house on the market, we wanted to get this much money because that's going to help us get moved to Montana. We're back in Montana again.
Okay.
Yeah. We're in Colorado earlier.
We're in Colorado.
Okay. Wherever they're going, right? We want this much money. It'll help us buy what we want to buy when we get there. Well, if the house lingers on the market, then all of a sudden it's like, gosh, okay, maybe we will accept this because bottom line is we got to get to Montana, right?
Right.
So that's one little phenomenon that goes on. But there's another little dirty secret about sometimes why houses sit on the market.
Okay.
You look at a house that's been on the market, and let's say you find a house that's been on the market way longer than average market time, okay? The first inclination is for the public to look at that house and say, gosh, there must be something wrong with that house. I wonder if there's something going on there, right?
Yeah.
Why is this going on, right? The truth might be that the real estate broker didn't price the home correctly to begin with. When they put it on the market, they overshot the market because they either had to get this price or the broker just didn't have enough information in front of them to say, look, this isn't competitive with what's going on in this area right now. So the house goes on at a price and it sits there because people are voting with their keyboards.
Yeah.
They're just saying, nope, not that one, not that one. So it's easy to think there might be something wrong with the price. There may be, or with the house, there may be nothing wrong with the house.
Right. There's chasing the market down.
What you don't notice is that they've done 3 price reductions because they learned the hard way.
Yeah.
So if you're a seller, pricing your home is still one of the most important steps you can have too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Al, what's the it's kind of the signature for a seller's market? What's the indicator?
Okay, so in the past they have said how many months of on-hand inventory do we have? And they came up with a number. Somebody waved a magic wand at some point and said 5.
5 months.
5 months. So in other words, if we never listed another home, based on our current selling rate, it would take us 5 months to sell everything that's available.
Right.
So I don't know that 5 is necessarily the magic number, but the way it works is you figure out what the equilibrium point of the market is. So if it's 5, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 3, who knows? But let's just use 5 as an example. If there is less inventory than 5 months on hand, then that means that things are selling, and the lower that number goes, the more advantageous it is to the seller, because the sellers don't have to make any concessions. The buyers are buying up everything. Yeah. So sort of kind of what we saw during COVID, right? It became a very strong seller's market.
Yeah.
Likewise, for those of us that can remember back to 07, 8, and 9, when it was all of a sudden months of on-hand inventory expanded greatly beyond the 5.
Those were fun days. What was the longest market time that you remember?
I remember in South Tacoma at one point, it was 12 months of on-hand inventory.
So you go, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'll see you in a year with an
I'm
offer.
going to list your home today, and I'll find you a buyer next year. This will be great.
So you got to have that perspective, though.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So in that case, we're way beyond that five number, which means
Yeah.
that buyers can call more shots. So that becomes more of a buyer's
Yeah.
market. So when you hear seller's market, buyer's market, it's not what your Uncle Bob did on his last transaction. It actually is directly related to market dynamics.
Yeah, and right now, and the reason I asked you that, we're kind of in this time where there are two things can be true at the same time. Our inventory is building, which means things aren't selling as fast, but it's still a seller's market because we're under that 5 month level mostly for the most part.
And that market time is affected by the price point of the home and the area the home is in, and there's a lot of dynamics that affect that. But you can look at that number and you can ask your agent. If your agent doesn't know that information, that's maybe your sign right there.
Right.
But you should know that. If you're a real estate broker watching this, you should know these things. You should be able to talk intelligently about what the market is doing right now. And then as a buyer, you're able to say, okay, well, then this makes sense. In this market right now, I can't offer 80% of what they're asking. I can't offer them to pay all of my closing costs and ask them to leave the dog. I can't get away with that in this market.
You could try, but it's not going to work out.
2009 might have worked.
Yeah.
Who knows, right? But right now, that's just not going to play. So if you're a buyer, and this is not on the Zillow thing, by the way, if you're a buyer and you're watching old real estate shows on cable TV that were filmed in Mississippi in 2004, and they're talking about painting the inside of the closet and emptying the litter box, and wow, we got $25,000 more for our house. That's not reality. That's not reality. That's called reality TV. So just understand that those shows are still airing every day.
Yeah, and that brings us to the last point we're going to talk about the Zillow list is waiving home inspections. Al, are we in a market where if we represent our buyer or our buyer in general, should they, but should they and do they need to waive their home inspection?
So if a buyer waives their home inspection, in Washington State, the home inspection is really your first opportunity as a buyer to really look under the hood, not just kick the tires. Really inspect what you're about ready to invest in. And so when you give up that right, you're assuming that everything on the seller disclosure statement is correct. And sometimes there's stuff that the seller doesn't know. I mean, right now, I don't know if I have a plumbing leak in my crawl space because I never go under my house, right?
You don't?
No, not really. I don't fit in most crawl spaces. But beside that, so not knowing that information means that you're kind of setting yourself up for projects because welcome to home ownership.
Yeah.
There's no landlord to call and say, hey, the light bulb in my oven is out. What up? You can't do that, right? So a home inspection is critical. We're in a market right now where a lot of people will waive their home inspection if they're in a multiple offer situation. But I always advise my clients, let's try to do this because I want to protect you as best we can. I would never give that up right out of the gate because if I said something like, hey, let's give up the home inspection, I want to get you this house, we may find out later the seller would have let you do a home inspection. Then I feel terrible.
Yeah.
And that's all the risks on the buyer's shoulders at that point.
Yeah. And I always, when I talk to my sellers, I always tell them, you want your buyer to have a home inspection. It is another insulator in case something happens after closing. The buyer can't say they were denied an inspection.
Yeah, let's say, for example, the seller did not know about that leak in the crawl space, right? And then a few months later, the buyer is blowing up the phone saying, hey, there's a leak in the crawl space. If they had a home inspection, then the seller just can basically say, well, your home inspector caught that, right?
Yeah.
We didn't know about it. So
I really think all sides should stay away from any kind of waiving of home inspections, even on the seller side. Encourage that buyer to get that inspection.
I think it really comes down to this. Would you buy a used car from an unknown party based on how it looks online?
I mean, I have.
Okay, bad question then, right?
So it's not a good idea.
So don't be Derek, right? Don't do that.
That's when you get it and it doesn't start.
Yeah, it doesn't start, and there's
$10,000 worth of stuff I have to do to make it drivable now.
And there are cats living in the engine compartment. So no, just don't. You wouldn't do that, right? So
no.
And we're talking about a whole lot more money than a used car right now. So just always be cautious. That's the best way to go.
Speaking of cars, this is a great segue into what we've been kind of talking about all week at our meetings. We like to refer to it as getting wrapped around the axle.
Yeah, yeah. So we're off the Zillow list now and what
Yeah.
their mistakes are they see buyers making. But we've been thinking a lot recently about how people get wrapped around the axle, so to speak, in real estate transactions.
And really, I kind of refer to it as accidentally backing into a situation that you could have avoided with some, experience. And
Right.
if not experience, listening to guys like us who've had, unfortunately, things happen with transactions with our brokers that we've been able to learn from. Right?
So what would be a good example of one of the top things on your list? What were some things that just come to mind?
Well, the first one that I can think of is if I'm representing a buyer and we walk into a house that is obvious. I hate using the word flip because remodeling a house is very complicated and it's not easy. And it's not just as easy as waving the lawn. We're flipping this house and making a ton of money. It's usually like you toil at it for months and months and months. And you might, if everything works out okay, make a couple dollars.
Exactly.
That's reality. That's not, TV version.
Sure.
You're showing your buyer a flip house and it looks great, right? And it's all remodeled and it's beautiful. So you want to be real careful though. You want to start asking questions. How much work was done?
Mm-hmm.
Did you get permits?
There you go. Permits. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
If you didn't get permits, that doesn't necessarily mean that the work isn't great.
Mm-hmm.
Did you disclose that you didn't get permits?
Right.
And did you get permits for the key things that you like electrical? Absolutely never can you just do your own electrical work.
Right.
Or plumbing. But if, let's say, for example, they put new countertops on or they painted the interior, if they disclose that and they didn't get permits for that, most buyers are going to be like, I don't care about that. It's just the major stuff.
You just mentioned another big red flag though too, which is if you can tell that this house, it's a 1940s house and this looks like a 2022 build. I mean, there's been a lot of work done over this house in the years, right? And the seller disclosure statement says, don't know.
That's
a
red
big red
flag.
flag. That's all the more reason why a home inspection is going to be your best friend. You need to find out what are you really buying because how many times do we hear stories of, we'll just drywall over the mold and they'll never know. Or whatever it happens to be, right? So,
and by the way, if you have a sharp broker representing you and you get a property disclosure form with a whole bunch of don't knows, that should be an immediate kick that form back to the seller and say, we're rejecting this until you fill it out.
yeah.
Because a property disclosure form is meant, even if you're a flipper, it's meant to disclose what you know about the property during the time that you've had the property under your ownership.
Correct. Also be aware if you're a buyer listening to this podcast, buyer beware is the mantra here in Washington State. It's up to you to inspect what you expect. So make sure you know what you're buying because if you were given an opportunity to do a home inspection and you didn't choose to do one for whatever reason, that could come back to bite you because somebody, if it ends up in court, they're just going to say, well, you were given an opportunity to do it and you let the time lapse. You never did it. That's not on us.
Yeah.
And it could be a remodeling issue that happened an owner or two before the current one.
Exactly. And that's why it's so difficult also in court to prove non-disclosure.
Yes.
Because a seller may not know, and you might think they do know, but you have to prove it.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of times, certain things are obvious, like the neighbor comes and says, well, I've seen him repairing that sewer line like 5 times.
Right.
And then the buyer goes, well, I didn't see anything in the disclosure. So that's a slam dunk.
Right.
But most things aren't a slam dunk.
Yeah, and usually, my luck, I'll be looking at the house when the neighbor's not home. So I don't have the neighbor to rely on. But they'll sure show up the day you move in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's another one that we just dealt with earlier this week in one of our offices, and that's as a real estate broker, you have a listing, and here comes a buyer, and the buyer is a contingent buyer. In other words, they have a home they need to sell before they can move forward and close on the purchase of your new listing, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of times where you need to start doing a little bit of homework to figure out how sellable is this buyer's house, because you're going to give them a limited time frame in which to get their property under contract. And so if you're lazy about doing that homework, that's not really good for your seller, because your seller's asking you, gosh, is their house sellable?
Yeah.
So at the very least, what I would be doing is talking to their broker to say, okay, what are your plans for selling that house? I can't control that, but I can sure talk about it. I can run a market analysis to see if what they're telling me they're going to price the home at makes sense. I might even ask them, gosh, can you arrange for me to do a walkthrough with you there?
Even better.
Just so I can walk through the house, I can take a look at how sellable it is, and then I can sit down with my clients and I can say, this house is a cream puff. This house is going to sell quickly. It's in an established neighborhood. Everybody seems to love this neighborhood. I'm not worried about this house finding a buyer in the next 30 days.
And what you just hit on is important. If seller's hiring your broker, they should be doing these things.
Yes.
And the thing is, when a house goes into contingent status, it's a little bit almost like it's in pending status. A lot of times it gets overlooked because, they have a contingent deal on it. And if I bring my buyers over and we go through all of this process to get an offer to them, they're just going to then send a notice to the other folks, and they're probably going to either waive their contingency or usually miraculously they get an offer out of the sky right when you submit yours. Right. So a lot of agents are deterred from showing, not from showing, but it's just a deterrent, right? For buyers and agents. It's like, it's already under contract.
Yeah. So if you are on the listing side of this, then you want to make sure that when you accept a contingent offer, it's because it's a pretty good bet that this is going to happen at the end of the time frame you need it to happen in. They can sell their house. You can get this closed, because remember that you're stacking cars on a train. So if you have the first listing, you're the engine, and then here comes the buyer with their car, and here comes their buyer, which is the caboose.
Have you ever had one of those, or 3 or 4?
We've had four cars on the train at once, and the caboose ends up pushing the train, which it means that the caboose is also in charge of whether or not that train derails. Because if the last buyer can't close, then that means the next buyer can't, the next buyer, and it's like dominoes just falling all over the place. Right?
Absolutely.
So it's worth watching them.
Yeah. The next one was jeopardizing earnest money by not paying attention to timelines.
Yeah, so understanding what your paperwork says is critical here, obviously. Also, giving yourselves a timeline by which you can deposit the earnest money in a reasonable fashion.
Yeah.
So many times we see brokers that say, I'll deposit it the next day, because they didn't ask their client, and their client wants to wire funds. Well, if the clients wire funds late in the afternoon, it may not reach escrow by the following day. There may be a delay in banking, or who knows what, right?
Which is another example also of if that happens, and in the meantime, the seller gets a much better offer, and the seller goes to check to see if your earnest money is deposited in a timely manner, and it's not, then what happens?
Well, there's a little form, and this is one of the few opportunities, by the way, that the seller has, where now the buyer's in default. Because they did not deposit their earnest money as per the terms of the contract. The seller can issue a notice that just says, hey, buyer, you're in default. This agreement is terminated, and we're out of here. And the buyer can do nothing about it.
Yeah.
So, and especially in a case where a seller might have a second offer coming in other words, just follow the terms and conditions of your contract. Know what it says. Know your timeline. If you're a real estate broker and you're relatively new at this, sit down in a quiet spot with a cup of coffee, take 5 minutes to jot down all the deadlines in your contract, get them on a piece of paper, then get them in your planner so you know when things are expiring, and put advance notices on them so you can remind your client what next steps are and what next deadlines are.
And it's even a good idea, if you're really going the extra mile, is to send an email out to all parties involved in the transaction with those timelines and say, here's what I have. Are we all on the same page here?
Yeah. And if you're brand new in this business, you should be sitting down with your managing broker, your designated broker, and saying, help me plan out these deadlines. And if you can't get that support at your office, you need to go find a better office, because there are people out there that care and want to see you succeed. And the last thing you want is missing earnest money deadlines, and having your clients lose out on a house because of something that you might have failed to do. So get the support you need to.
Yeah. Our next one is kind of an oddball, but it happens, and when it does, it can be a really tough one. And that's accepting two offers at the same time. Can you believe that can happen?
Yeah.
It can. And I'll give you this scenario because we had it happen years ago. Years ago, we had a transaction where we represented the seller, and there were multiple offers, and our seller issued what is called a simultaneous counteroffer, which basically says, here's what we want, right? But they issued it to multiple buyers. And what happened is two of them signed off at the same time and delivered them back. And then we had a problem because we had sold the house twice.
So they were countering multiple people.
Yeah, without the option to select one over the other, the way the language was written in the simultaneous counteroffer. So you got to really make sure you have a broker that understands the paperwork and how to handle multiple offers.
So selling your house to two different people would be bad?
It's troubling.
Troubling, troubling, right?
Yeah, in this case, somebody had to basically give up their commission to cover the earnest money. So,
well, good takeaway. The other time that comes up, we just talked about contingency sales, right? One of the things the seller has, let's say the seller has sold their house to a contingent buyer, and we're in that process waiting for that buyer to find their buyer. The seller has the opportunity to continue looking for additional buyers. And if they find one, then they serve notice on the first buyer that says, hey, we previously agreed that if we found another buyer, we'd give you X number of days to basically put up or shut up.
Right.
Get this done or go away. You get your deposit back,
What's
but we
that
want to
called
move forward with
in
the second buyer.
Our language is a bump.
Bump notice. Here's another slang word to
It's
avoid
slang.
using with buyers.
But if
and
you hear the
sellers,
word
right?
bump notice, folks, that means
Yeah.
they're trying to knock out the other buyer.
Exactly. So when you do that, though, you negotiate with this new second buyer before you ever serve notice on your first buyer, right? But you have to use the second buyer addendum, because the second buyer addendum is a specific form that tells the second buyer you've already sold it to somebody else. You're just waiting for certain things to happen, and that's what prevents you from accidentally selling your house twice.
Yeah.
So watch out for that form too. It's form 39.
There's more scenarios than these two, but two is enough, right?
Right.
It gives you the idea that basically you got to know your paperwork inside and out.
Right.
All right.
The other one was not negotiating on your client's behalf or speaking on behalf of your clients to other people without talking to them first.
Boy, we talk about this all the time. Here's a scenario. Hey, Alan, my buyers want to offer $1.1 million on your $1.3 million house, but it's all cash, quick close. How do you think they'll feel about that?
Don't even bother. I know my clients wouldn't even consider something like that.
That's kind of it.
You might as well tell them their kids are ugly. No way. Not happening. Not happening.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not bothering to present this idea to my clients.
Unless you have like a telepathic highway.
Yeah. No, we already talked about this. If Derek offers 1.1, we're not saying it.
Yeah.
No, you talk to your client and you say, even if it's a phone call. Yeah, it's not in writing, so it's less than real, but still make the phone call and say, hey, I've got somebody. They said they might be willing to offer this. They didn't want to put anything on paper until they knew we were in the ballpark. What are your thoughts? I always like the phrase that, I can control most of the process. My clients make the decisions. I don't make decisions on behalf of my client. I want to tell them what their options are. We have path A, path B. Here's what we see on these paths. What are you comfortable with in doing? But I can't tell you how many times, I know my client would never go for that.
Yeah, and the answer, if you represent the seller brokers, is just, yes, I'll pass it on and see what they say, right?
Yeah.
Don't get in the way of your own deal, and don't get in the way on your seller's behalf. And here's the other thing, on representing buyers. When you put something on paper and you put it in front of a seller, they might change their mind.
They might.
How many times have you seen that where I'm going to come in maybe a little bit lower than they might anticipate? I'm going to make them an offer. That's the whole idea behind it. It's an offer.
Right.
It's not, I'm going to give them everything they want.
Right.
But,
And there's a lot of times the seller may accept that offer because we don't know what's going on in their life. Again, they've got to get to Montana and now their game has changed, right? So, but we don't know that. And so you put your best foot forward, you do the best job possible, you present it, and that's usually just step one of many steps. And don't make decisions for your clients. Say, what do you want to do? This, or this? Okay, let's go for it.
I just have to assume that most people are like alike. I sometimes will say things like, "I'm not taking less than X amount," right? And then something comes across the table, and it's less than X amount, and I look at it, and I look at the closing date, and I think about my current picture, and I might change my mind.
Well, and now it's real because now it's on paper.
Yeah,
So now it's not just talking about it. Now it's like, okay, show me that net again. What's the net proceeds on this? So
my thinking changes when it becomes real.
So what do you think? Another area is about us, giving people advice about things that we see that we might consider red flags. Maybe we want to look into things like, is there a boundary dispute? Are there things missing on a disclosure statement? So many times I think some people may want to turn a blind eye about this and, I just figure it out, that fence has been there, and everybody's happy.
Yeah.
And I have a situation in one of my neighbor's properties where the backside of their property, if you do the aerial shot, you can clearly see their neighbor has encroached on their property by at least 10 feet. So
Right.
it's not even close. It's like, wow, you're way over the property line here. So, that's when we need to get our clients in the loop and say, hey, this is going on, and start doing some digging.
Yeah, I mean, that is what title insurance is for. But if it's obvious to you, or you have a situation at the property, we just recently had an agent who was out on a property with his buyer. The buyer was in contract, so I think they were doing their inspection, and it's a flag lot. So in other words, it kind of the lot is their house is in the front, and there's a driveway along the side. And then there's a parcel behind it, a rectangular parcel that the driveway feeds into. That's their neighbor that lives behind them.
Right.
They're out there doing their inspection. The neighbor pulls in to the driveway and says, "This driveway is mine. You can't encroach on this." Right?
Yeah.
So we did some research with our buyer, and we discovered, no, actually, this property belongs to the buyer, and they've granted an easement to that back lot.
Right.
So having those conversations with a neighbor before you close is really important. Hey, here's what I discovered. We need to be on the same page. I don't want boundary line disputes after closing, which is like one of the number one things and kind of most loathsome things, because it requires a bunch of surveys and you got to go to court and it's a whole thing, right? So we want to avoid that.
Right.
Or
and
avoid getting into
imagine your client saying, well, why didn't you tell me about this?
Right.
It seems like you knew about this when you took the listing, or blah, 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 or blah, 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 or you found out this when I was looking to buy the house. So, get out in front of that stuff. Don't let sleeping dogs lie.
Right.
Just wake them up and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, because, as brokers, we're not obligated to try to dig up stuff on the property.
Right.
But if it becomes apparent that there might be an issue, of course, and that's what we're here for. Yeah. We're not professional surveyors. We're not home inspectors. That's why we advise you to have all those things, and we'll guide you through that. But if something just pops up that's obvious, we can't ignore it.
No, absolutely not. So what do you think about, maybe we touched on this a little earlier, what do you think about overpricing a listing? Just so this came up and made me think about it. You're listing a property, and you know what they want to hear? They want to hear it's worth, X.
Because they probably telegraphed that to you in a conversation that I think it's worth $800,000, and all your comps are showing 7.
And your neighbor across the street who is unsold for 3 months is at 800. So ours must be worth 800.
Yeah.
So you take a listing at 800, knowing that's what they want to hear. It gets you the sign in the yard. but you know you're going to have to start working them for price reductions coming up here in the next couple of weeks. So do you
Yeah.
think that's a good strategy?
It's a bad strategy, and I'm not blaming anybody for. I don't think most brokers intentionally take a listing too high. I think what happens is we're all, probably most of us, want to please people, right? This is just a natural tendency. You want to do things that make people happy,
Right.
right? It's kind of running in the back of your operating system at all times. So when you're on an appointment with a seller and he's talking about the neighbor's unsold house that's listed for 800,000 and that they're getting a lot of showings, it just kind of sways you to go, okay, maybe we can try that, right?
Right.
Until you try it and it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
So we have to deal with facts, and the facts are pending and sold comps, mostly sold comps. That's what an appraiser is going to use. He's going to go back, he or she will go back 6 months and use similar properties in a similar area, and solds, particularly solds, are count the most.
Right. Yeah. So your unsold properties or the active inventory.
That's competition.
That's your competition, right?
Yeah.
That's okay. Here's what our competition's doing. How does that compare to what we need to get done? But if you're intentionally doing that with the idea that, I got them, and now I'll just hammer them for price reductions later, that's not doing you any favors.
That's a tough way to go
Yeah.
for the broker. It's a tough way to go for the seller, and it's just not I don't advise it.
Right. So last one.
Okay.
Last one. We just talked about this earlier this morning. Not knowing what the paperwork says. Let's talk specifically about either bank-owned properties or maybe a builder who has their own paperwork, their own contracts, 57 pages long, and it's not on the standard forms that we look at and know because we use daily. What are your thoughts on that?
Huge warning here. There are, lenders and builders out there that generate their own paperwork, so that it's not a standard form that most agents use. And you have to read every page. Here's the story for you. We had a closing not too long ago, within the last couple of months. We represented the buyer, and we're going to kind of tell on ourselves. That's what we're here for, to learn from mistakes. We represented the buyer. It was a bank-owned property. There's not that many of them anymore, but this one happened to be a bank-owned property. The bank generated like 50 pages of paperwork, right? So our broker had their buyer sign off on it, and buried in the paperwork and only discovered right before closing was a little paragraph that said basically that the buyer has to pay the excise tax.
Excise tax being?
That's a tax that is charged by the state of Washington on every sale.
It's like a sales tax, right? On the selling.
Yeah, and it's almost 99.9% of the time that's the seller's responsibility to pay. That's built into our standard paperwork.
Right.
But in this case, the bank said, no, we don't want to pay that. We want you to pay it. Now imagine you find this out the day before closing. Now we ended up with a positive outcome. There are some things that we did at the last minute to correct this, but that was a big, red flag, more than a red flag, deal killer, right? And possibly even worse, right? You get the wrong scenario, you could have lots of problems with a situation like that. And there are other things besides just excise tax. If you have a 50-something page form from the seller, it's probably not in the buyer's favor.
Right. And so it's been written by probably attorneys who are representing that party, the builder or the bank or whatever. So there's probably going to be very little that's buyer biased in those forms. Yeah. So the takeaway is, if you are a buyer and you're getting involved in one of these transactions, if you're a real estate broker and you're representing somebody that wants to buy one of these, sit down, nice cup of coffee.
Slow it down for a second.
Slow it down and just read everything. And it doesn't hurt to just take out a highlighter and start hitting the things that you have questions about. And then later on, you can go back and review them and get answers so you know what you're dealing with. If everybody knows what they're dealing with and they're all good with it, hey, it's all roses. But if you find out after the fact that you missed something that's going to cost them time or money, it's a big deal.
And that's why, we were talking about the buyer side earlier. That's why it's just really important to establish a solid relationship with whoever you're working with, both as a broker and as a buyer or seller. You just need to be able to have these conversations where you're reading the paperwork going, hey, what's this? You not feel embarrassed or shy about
Right,
it, right?
right.
I need to know what I'm signing.
Yep, we're all getting in this car together and we're going on a trip. And
Yeah.
we're going to get to know each other whether we like it or not. So let's have a good time and let's get an end result that you're going to love. Because from the real estate broker side of the thing, I want my clients to be so happy when the transaction is over that they'd be crazy not to refer to me to any of their friends or relatives, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, gosh, you got to call Al. You got to call Al. That's what I'm trying to build my business on. And I can't do that if I'm burning bridges every transaction I do.
That's what it's all about. I mean, ultimately, my goal, and I know it's yours too, is to end up with a new set of friends or new friends in the transaction and somebody that they trust to take care of them, right? And
Absolutely.
the only way you can get there is to actually do the work and, have the conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that, we're moving on to brighter things. I think the market is it seems to be getting a little bit better on all sides, and the mortgage interest rates are creeping down. They pop back up, but I think in general they'll have a downward trajectory, and I think that'll be good for everybody as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't get wrapped around the axle
Don't get
and
wrapped
avoid
around
some
it.
common mistakes and just communicate with both your agents if you're a buyer or a seller or your clients if you're a real estate broker.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Next time.